Orchestra first chair violinist Theo Brennan's 22-year marriage collapses when his wife Veronica leaves him for wealthy Roland Ashford. At his lowest, Theo receives a Pentagon call. His grandfather Eugene, a wartime cryptography specialist, left encoded evidence of massive defense-era corruption and hidden Swiss accounts. The paperwork and a storage unit reveal Ashford family involvement in profiteering that caused soldiers' deaths. Theo must choose between silence and safety, take Pentagon compensation, or exposing the truth. He publishes the findings with a journalist cousin, channels the revelation into a foundation for veterans, and performs his grandfather's unpublished redemption suite, transforming legacy, loss, and justice into art and restitution. The boxes looked like a cemetery, uniform, dull, anonymous. I sat cross-legged on the hardwood, the radiator cold against my spine, divorce papers folding into the crease of my hand. Outside the window, Lake Michigan argued with wind and made the city look like a bruise. The timestamp on the decree, 2:47 p.m., felt like punctuation. Somewhere a judge had dropped a gavel on everything I thought I owned. Veronica's message arrived like a laugh. "Someone else's face in my living room," she wrote. "His grand piano is in your music room now." The photograph she sent was a close-up of Roland Ashford, hand braced on the mahogany where my fingers had once grazed. His smile had teeth. In the background, a Harvard diploma hung where my grandfather's medals used to be. The rest of the house was blurred into trophies he'd bought with other people's silence. I let the phone fall and watched it ring on the rug. An unknown number, zeros threaded with a single one, blinked at me like a code. I only answered because the afternoon had already hollowed me. A voice came in precise and cold as metal. "Colonel James Whitmore, Pentagon." "Mr. Brennan, you must listen." It felt like a prank until the colonel said my grandfather's name. "Eugene Brennan, Staff Sergeant, 5th Special Forces Group, Night Music." The words landed in the room like a second divorce. My life split, and something else unfolded in the fissure. Eugene had a piano and secrets. Those two things had always belonged together in our home. He played with that slow wrist that made the keys sound like weather. My father told stories from the edge of his whiskey glass, never finishing them. Now the colonel finished what a family never could. Eugene had recovered something in Cambodia. Not just documents, numbers, accounts, a coded ledger. It had been classified beyond top secret. 60 years. The classification expired last night. My hands remembered the violin the way grief remembers itself. I stood, the wood of the floorboard loud beneath my soles, and went to the single box I had refused to let Veronica touch, Grandpa Eugene's things. Her handwriting on the top read like an accusation. Inside, the journal smelled of cigarette smoke and lemon oil, music scribbles, coffee stains, scrawled dates. On the margin of the first page, a pencil inscription nearly rubbed away, "For Theodore, when everything ends." The colonel told me about a sealed file, a plane, a pilot named Clauve, and a briefcase someone had turned in to command. He told me the figure, $156 million with interest, and then he told me the condition. I had 72 hours to complete what Eugene had started and bring the journal to the Pentagon. If I didn't, the money reverted to the Department of Defense. Outside, the city sharpened into glass and knife. Inside, the apartment still smelled faintly of Veronica, a perfume framed by linen and a life rearranged to suit someone else. I found a photograph folded between pages, a young Eugene in fatigues, expression tight, eyes like an argument. Something else glued to the corner, a train ticket stub dated 1964. In the darkness between lines, he had written in code, rhythms, and strange numbers in a hand I'd always assumed belonged to a musician. When I closed the journal, a chord settled in my chest like possibility. There's a strange arithmetic to loss. Divide everything you know by the number of secrets left. I had lost a house, a marriage, a pattern of mornings and late rehearsals. But here was a ledger, a directive from a dead man who seemed to have been thinking ahead for decades. "When my grandson has nothing to lose," the colonel had said. The phrase had cadence, as if it belonged in a score. I pressed the journal to my chest, as if it were a Mendelssohn part, a prayer. The keys on my phone blurred. A flight to Washington in 3 hours. Window seat 14A. First class, my grandfather's whim, apparently. I laughed once, a small sound that tasted like tin, then packed the journal into my backpack. The morning had folded into a single decision, to go or to stay and let the quiet bury whatever truth the past kept playing. I walked into the elevator with the instrument case at my back and a melody in my head I didn't yet understand. Night music, Eugene called it once, and when the door side closed I felt the unusual comfort of being called to account by family you thought you had already buried. The Pentagon is not a building that apologizes. It folds itself inward, security layers like old concertos, entrance, key, clearance, then silence. Colonel Whitmore's handshake was brief, the kind that reads as a statement, "We are all business until we are not." He led me down levels that smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant until fluorescent lights set the room in a clinical halo. File boxes sat on a metal table like props for a trial. "What you must know," Whitmore said, "is that your grandfather hid things in plain sight." He opened a folder and slid photographs across the surface. Eugene, jungled and young, a wrecked aircraft that shouldn't have been there, a man named Clove with eyes like a closed fist. Interleaved were musical bars, compositions Eugene had written, each date aligning with a mission log. Footnotes were dynamics, but notations revealed numbers. The colonel's mouth made a line when I traced them. To him they were evidence. "You ever hear him play?" Whitmore asked. I nodded. The old man had played at nursing homes, at veteran clubrooms, at holiday recitals where the songs tasted like tobacco and regret. "He left you the map in those measures," Whitmore said. He wanted a descendant who'd see music as more than music. Outside the vault of bureaucracy, the rest of my life hissed like a record with a scratch. Veronica's lawyer had already filed. The house smelled of disinfectant and designer candles in the memory of it. Roland's face haunted the edges of memory, his laugh, too loud in rooms that tried to be small, the way his coat lay like another claim on things I'd once owned. When Whitmore told me that William Ashford, Roland's grandfather, appeared on Swiss deposit logs, I felt an old twist in my gut become a new, bitter knot. I spent the red-eye rereading Eugene's handwriting until the hotel room blurred into midnight ink. There was a method to the madness, cadences that folded into accounts, movements that spelled coordinates, tiny rhythmic deviations that read as numbers. I found 3 words scrawled in the corner of an otherwise empty page: Baltimore. Unit 447. Lock 9. When you play, you map. It was the sort of thing a man who had lived 2 lives, soldier and musician, might do, bury truth inside beauty. The journey to the storage unit smelled like diesel and lost promises. The facility was older than the people who worked there, brickwork that had taken on the color of rain. Inside, I located a metal cabinet that looked misplaced. On top, a chessboard mid-game, bishop for a knight. My hands trembled, not from the cold. The key turned. Inside, a safety deposit key and a leather folio waited like an accusation. There were ledgers, photocopies of Swiss accounts, and a folder stamped with Ashford Industries. My finger hovered over the name like a pursuing shadow. There was a chess notation in Eugene's margin: Budapest Gambit, sacrifice to gain position. He had taught me that when I was small, teaching that loss is sometimes exchanged for gain. I understood then that this was not about money alone. The accounts connected to defective parts, logs of helicopter components that had failed mid-flight, invoices with margins so obscene they read like a murder weapon. Someone's phone buzzed in the next lane. I thought of Veronica, daytime yoga, artful lunches, and the taste of new perfume. I thought of the way she'd told me once that I loved dead composers more than the living. Maybe she was right. My practice was devotion, a private liturgy that made living people feel less necessary. Roland's voice arrived like a cold draft in the storage unit, practiced, thinly veiled threat. He suggested I take the Pentagon compensation, disappear, let him keep his name and his money. His offer was not generous. It was pragmatic, dirty with the logic of a man raised to prefer balance sheets over bodies. "Silence buys you comfort," he said. "Truth, well, truth buys you enemies." I closed my fist around the leather folder. The names on those lists were boys, dates, serial numbers, the kind of detail that turns a ledger into a roll call. I thought of mothers watching an empty chair in the mess hall. I had never been asked to choose between comfort and conscience before. When I called Dennis, my cousin and the one person who had not learned to smooth edges for public view, He laughed in that way journalists do before they stop laughing. "We publish," he said, "immediate and hungry. But you know this will ruin everything, Roland, your marriage, maybe you. Are you ready?" He had framed the question as if it were merely logistical. The real question was quieter and worse. Did I want to be the one who made the music stop? At dinner that night, I held my violin case like a talisman. The strings inside hummed against wood, a small animal of tension and pitch. I'd known patterns my whole life. I recognized cadence and counterpoint like a person recognizes faces. Eugene had left me a score that was a map, and the map had names attached to death. The next day, we set the plan: document, publish, redirect the money to families. Dennis would call his sources. I would play a public piece Eugene had left near the end of his journal, a composition that functioned as both requiem and cipher. The plan was simple in the way that a staged rebellion is simple: courage, clarity, and timing. But secrets have a gravity. When you unseal a chest like this, you also unseal a life you might not get back. Roland would not go quietly. Veronica might return with apologies shaped to mend what had been broken. And somewhere, in a White House office or a boardroom with blinds, someone would decide whether men who profit from war would be punished or protected. The first legal filings hit my inbox at dawn. The machine had begun to turn. The day we published felt like a concert opening night, lights too bright, audience breathless. Dennis's story ran across every platform with a byline that smelled of old newsroom glue. Headline: War Profits, Swiss Accounts, and a Musician's Cipher. The first wave of reaction was deliciously kinetic: outrage, the market seizing, tweets stacking like debris. Ashford stock tanked. Roland called twice and left voicemails that escalated from measured menace to personal fury. Then the call came that made everything blur. A federal grand jury had been convened. Roland's father was subpoenaed. Roland himself was named in an investigation. I felt relief like a physical thing, air moving into a lung that had been held closed. But alongside it, there was an unquiet, a noise like static under music. Evidence had power, yes. But it also had consequences, and not all of them were righteous. Dennis wanted the story to move faster. "We exposed them," he said, tapping the table. "Now push. More documents, more witnesses." Pressure moves the needles. The urge for momentum is contagious in newsrooms. Build friction until something breaks. I was tempted. I had been tempted for days by the simplicity of other options. Take the Pentagon settlement, disappear, host lectures, teach, live peacefully. But I kept thinking about a photograph of a crashed helicopter with a nameplate that read, "Private Ellis, age 19. The ledger had been arithmetic. The ledger had also been a person. Then Roland changed the ground beneath my feet. He delivered a counterpunch neither Dennis nor I expected. The phone call arrived at 3:17 a.m., and I heard my name before I knew the voice. "You'll lose everything you have," he said, voice smooth like glass cut at an edge. "You publish these lies and my lawyers will make you pay. There are files they can show about your grandfather." He paused, and in his pause I felt the past leaning toward me like a shadow. "We have eyewitness accounts that Mr. Brennan's grandfather was involved in black market trading. There are testimonies, rogue affidavits that contradict your story." The accusation landed like a throw. For an instant, I felt dizzy, not from fear of jail, but from the sense of betrayal. My own lineage could be used like a weapon against me. Whitmore had drilled me on the redactions. We'd seen the official photos together. But Roland's lawyers had resources, and in their hands, public perception is malleable. The news cycle spun, and soon a conservative outlet posted a piece, "Hero or Crook? New evidence challenges Brennan family narrative." The piece cherry-picked old rumors and anonymous quotes from men who might benefit from confusion. We had expected pushback. This is how systems protect themselves, but nobody had warned me how it would feel to see my grandfather's name dragged through the mud. My father called in the middle of the night, quiet and brittle. "Do you think your grandfather would want this?" he asked. He had always been softer about Eugene's secrecy. Maybe it had been survival instinct. "He kept his mouth shut to keep us safe," my father said. "You're waving a torch at things people wanted dark." I walked to the rehearsal room and set my violin on my shoulder, not to play the piece Dennis and I had planned, but to play until string wore thin. The notes came out of me wrong at first, the bow scraping like an old man clearing his throat. Then, haltingly, a line found itself and the music made sense again. The melodies in Eugene's journal were patterns, rhythm as code, code as memory. Each phrase had within it both accusation and apology. Whitmore advised patience. The law moves slowly, he said, but when it moves with teeth. He also whispered, less formally, that there were people who would prefer the ledger never found. We have protections in place, he said, but his voice carried the weight of someone who has read too many redactions. A week later, my mailbox held a printed photograph that had not been sourced from journalists. Veronica in Roland's apartment, not the staged shot Dennis had used. It was taken earlier that week, her expression unreadable. The image came with a short note: think of your losses before you make others lose more. The anonymous sender had not called. Someone wanted to intimidate me into silence. Fear is practical. It makes your choices simpler. I slept badly, if I slept at all. In the mornings I'd go over the ledger, the bank transfers like a score I had to decipher aloud. Every name led to another name. The knots of small betrayals that had made my marriage unravel suddenly looked like stitches in a larger seam. Veronica's material hunger, Roland's family history, William Ashford's business decisions. It all read like a stave where the melody was greed and the counterpoint was death. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked like an actor in someone else's role. Beard, stubble, tired eyes, a man who held a secret too big for him. I could still walk away. The Pentagon compensation was real, irrevocable, if accepted. It would buy the kind of distance that hushes both cameras and creditors. But when I thought about the faces in the crash reports, the boys who never came back and the mothers who could not sleep, I felt the chord in my chest that had always guided my music, a wrong that needed a right, no matter the cost. We decided to move forward. Dennis prepared for legal countermeasures. Whitmore provided additional declassified fragments to corroborate our paper trail. I called Veronica and let the ringtone run out. She called back twice and then stopped. The public fight seemed to sharpen whatever private wound I carried. Nothing in the world was clean anymore. The midday sky outside my window turned the color of overcooked steel. The next move would be visible to more than us: regulators, markets, families, and men with money who had everything to lose. Pushback hardened into volleys. Legal letters saturated our inbox, threats of libel, subpoenas demanding the journalist's source, and a smear campaign that reached for my grandfather's reputation like a glove. Roland hired high-priced counsel and a private investigator who apparently adored chess metaphors and quiet threats. The investigator's report surfaced in anonymous outlets within 48 hours. Headlines questioned motive, methods, and motive again. Dennis and I worked the newsroom like surgeons, careful, scalloping away tissue where infection might spread. I sat in a small conference room at the paper with 2 attorneys and Dennis. The lawyers were efficient and blunt. Expect escalation. You'll be sued, one said. They'll try to freeze assets. They'll file restraining orders and character statements from people who never met you. Dennis leaned forward. Then we prepare for it. We have whistleblowers lined up, bank confirmations, forensic accounting. When they go for narrative, we go for documents. Proof invited the nation into the room. Families of soldiers reached out. We met with men who had the look of those who had lost something they could never reclaim. A mother in her 70s pressed a photograph into my palm, a smiling boy, hair combed, uniform crisp. Her hands trembled as if the picture itself could unravel. They told me it was an accident, she said. They told us nothing. I felt the ledger in my coat like a second heart. The trust we proposed, redirecting the Swiss funds to the families, began to feel less like a PR move and more like a reckoning. Outside the courtroom of public opinion, the machinery of power churned. Whitmore arranged for a secure deposition. He warned of dangers we hadn't imagined: private corporate security teams that monitored our reporting, and men who had used whispers effectively for lifetimes. The colonel's voice hardened when he said, "They will threaten you, Mr. Brennan. They will use your past, your family, your art. Be prepared." Roland's campaign moved faster than expected. His lawyers filed an injunction to freeze the Swiss accounts, arguing chain of custody issues and asserting the accounts were legitimate inheritances. The temporary restraining order arrived in my inbox the same morning the markets delisted Ashford subsidiaries, pending investigation. Roland's father appeared on television, gaunt and defiant, calling the accusations politically motivated. The scenes changed hour by hour, and the story became a series of chess moves, each side sacrificing little things to win larger positions. At home, the house I'd lost hovered like a ghost. I found myself compulsively checking public filings online even as I tried to practice for a performance I'd promised to give for a veterans fundraiser. My hands could still find the right harmonics, but my mind was full of ledger lines and redactions. In the quiet between rehearsal and meeting with Dennis, I found a cassette tape in Eugene's folio, labeled in handwriting that shook, Koslov Confession. When I played it, a voice rasped through crackle and static. There was a confession, painful and disjointed, by a man with a foreign lilt admitting knowledge of payments and deals. The tape did not make our case bulletproof, but it widened the fracture. For the first time, it put a human voice into the ledger, someone who had been in the room and had named names. Dennis called contacts in Geneva and Zurich. Forensic accountants traced transactions that hovered like ghost currents between shell corporations. The snowball we'd started now had momentum. It would downhill, it would hit, and it would not stop. But momentum invites counterforce. One evening, as I left the Lincoln Park brownstone where I worked with a small team, a dark SUV followed at a courteous distance. It tailed me through side streets until my phone vibrated with an anonymous message. Family suffers when secrets are aired. Choose peace. I slowed the car at a red light and watched the taillights move away like red notes in a slow measure. The message lingered. Choose peace. The phrase had been used before. This was no longer simply about proving a crime. It had become the kind of fight that rearranges reputations and ruins private lives. Dennis argued for more transparency. Publish everything we had, leave no shadow. Whitmore counseled containment and delayed release only when it meant keeping people alive. I had always thought music asked for courage. I hadn't expected to learn what courage meant when facing men who measured consequences in ruined families. Then, in the quiet of my small office, I played Eugene's Redemption Suite. The melody unspooled, notes that in the ledger translated to coordinates and bank codes, but musically it was a lament. It braided mourning and accusation so tightly I felt the two as one. The afternoon light fell across the piano keys like a verdict. I realized the suite wasn't just instruction, it was tribute. Eugene had encoded both truth and sorrow in the same bar line. If I published everything without considering the living, I would replicate the coldness he'd once tried to avoid. That night, I called Veronica. Her voice sounded small on the other end. "Theo, they're calling me." "I don't," she began, then stopped. She didn't ask me to stop. She only said, "This will ruin me. In a different life, we might have negotiated a salvage." Now her plea sounded like a private echo of the mothers who had already called me. I could buy her silence with money, but I could not buy the dead back. The court papers arrived the next morning, an injunction, a temporary freeze on funds, and a contempt claim listing me among those who would precipitate financial ruin. Roland's legal team had done the math. They had not underestimated the cost of public truth. The scoreboard was marked, legal battles, journalism, and music all staged under the same unforgiving roofs. We scheduled a press conference for dawn. Dennis wanted cameras, files, and named men. Whitmore scheduled an internal review. I scheduled my hands. Something in the air had shifted. The fight had left the private and become public, messy and moral in a way I could not walk away from. I put Eugene's journal on the piano and felt the weight of an old man's gamble, a score that demanded a performance. The press gallery filled like a theater before opening night. Phones hummed, cameras clicked in steady rhythms, and the collective breath of listeners created a taut hush. Dennis stood to my left, a mountain of dog-eared notes and legal memos. Whitmore sat at the end of the table with a face that had done battle with secrecy for years. For a while the world held its line between outrage and curiosity. I spoke first because the suite had taught me how to carry a phrase. My grandfather chose silence, I told the room, my voice steadier than I felt. He did it to protect us. He did it to protect a country that sometimes asks too much of the people it sends off to war. But silence is a choice, and choices beget consequences. I opened the portfolio and set the documents down like a map to be read. Photocopies, transcripts, bank confirmations, each one a measure and a movement. Dennis walked them through the accounting. The journalists asked sharp questions, some framed like blades. Roland's team responded through intermediaries that afternoon with character denunciations and legal threats. But for every call into question, we had a ledger, a tape, an accountant's signature. The truth had weight, and for the first time since the first article, I felt it bearing down in the right direction. When reporters asked what I intended to do with the money, I had already rehearsed it: a trust for the families of soldiers who died in crashes linked to defective parts, a foundation in my grandfather's name to support veterans and music therapy programs. The plan sounded ambitious and sentimental in the same breath. Someone in the back asked about private restitution. Someone else asked about criminal charges. I answered again and again, and each answer felt less like defense and more like decision. The legal skirmishes intensified. Injunctions were filed and dissolved in swift, messy rounds. Ashford Industries shuttered several international offices as investigators raided corporate records. Roland was arrested not for murder, but for tax fraud and obstruction, the pragmatic charges prosecutors can prove. The spectacle was public and ugly. Veronica called once then again, voice small, pleading. "Please," she said finally. "Come home." She wasn't asking to reunite, she was asking to be forgiven. The girls from the military families came forward in groups. I met them one by one. Their faces were not the faces in a political brief, they were people. A soldier's widow named Mirabelle told a story about a son who loved moths and kept a jar of them under his bed. A father described waiting 3 weeks for a phone call that never came. When we handed over the first tranche of funds to a local chapter in a cramped church basement, a man opened his hands and stared into them like someone watching a ghost lift its veil. There was, of course, pushback, more threats, another anonymous envelope containing a photo of my mother outside a grocery store, and the kind of quiet menacing that is impossible to litigate. But there were also voices. Whistleblowers from inside companies who spoke on the record, and retired officers who corroborated parts of Eugene's account. The justice we enacted was not perfect, law rarely is, but for the first time, pieces fell into place. On a gray afternoon months later, Roland was sentenced. The courtroom was packed, cameras shoved elbows to get a better angle. He wore a suit that no longer fit the world he'd imagined he could own. He didn't look like a monster, he looked like a man whose measure had been misread. The sentence was not enough to return grief to the families, but it was recognition. The final act occurred not in a courtroom but in a concert hall. I had chosen to premiere Eugene's Redemption Suite, the piece that had been both map and requiem. The hall was full: families, veterans, critics, reporters who had followed the story, and anonymous people who'd streamed the scandal online. The orchestra rose into the opening movement, a line winding like a question. Midway through an adagio, I felt the audience inhale as if the music had reminded them to breathe. The middle movement contained a melody the colonel and the accountants had called code. As I played it, I thought of the ledger and the lists of boys who had laughed and promised the moon. The final bars slurred into a silence so full it felt loud. When the lights came up and applause roared, I didn't feel it the way musicians often do. Instead, I felt the heavy, small satisfaction of having made a choice and watched it land. After the performance, Mirabelle approached with her son's photograph. She kissed the sheet music and said, "Thank you." It was small and large at once, gratitude folded into sorrow, a public gesture that made private wounds visible. I thought of Eugene in his Navy uniform, hands seasoned by keys and wood, who had left a puzzle only a grandson would have the chance to solve. I had thought revenge would be sweet. It wasn't. What replaced it was a deeper, quieter understanding. Justice was not simply punishment, but repair. The money didn't bring bodies back, but it bought education, care, and the presence of someone at a funeral. It bought acknowledgement. In the weeks that followed, I turned down offers to disappear. I accepted instead to steward the foundation, to teach, to play in places where story and music could be used to heal. The world was more complicated, the villains less cartoonish. Veronica married again, this time to a man whose version of safety suited her, but she called once to say she hoped I found peace. I said I already had found something else, which was enough. 6 months after the trial, I stood in a small room above a VA clinic where children of veterans clustered around an old upright piano. Mismatched chairs, posters about mindfulness, and a kettle that whistled in the corner made the place smell like ordinary life. I'd arranged the program so that each weekend we transformed the grief into instruction, free lessons, ensembles for kids who'd never played, therapy sessions that let sound unlock things words could not. On the wall hung a framed photograph of Eugene, younger than I'd seen him in family albums, eyes stubbornly bright. Under it, someone had stitched a small plaque, Night Music, Eugene Brennan, 1964. The plaque was not celebratory, it was a record. People came in and out of the room, leaving with music under their arms and something steadier in their faces. It was slow work, it didn't make headlines. It placed fingers on strings and held them there while lives rewrote themselves. The foundation had become my life by degrees, trustees, a modest office in a brownstone, quarterly reports. We'd paid out significant restitution and funded scholarships for veterans' children. Yet the money wasn't the centerpiece. The trust's true currency had become narrative, giving families their stories back and reminding institutions that names on ledgers correspond to people. I had a ticket to Symphony Center that evening, but I rarely went as a spectator. Instead, I walked the stage before the performance, practicing passages from Redemption Suite in the nearly empty hall. The acoustics remembered me in the same way they remembered everyone who'd ever stood where I stood, interesting because of the sound you coaxed, not the suit you wore. I tuned my violin to the room, feeling Eugene's rhythm as something less like instruction and more like choreography for conscience. My mother came to the front row that night, the woman who had kept family stories stitched together with the seam of daily life. She'd watched the trial on a small television and then kept to her garden as if to let the soil deal with things. After the performance, she took my hand in both of hers and said the kind of thing I had never expected to hear. He'd be proud you didn't just take the money. Pride is an odd inheritance. It sits next to shame and gratitude like an uneasy dinner guest. I thought about my father's stern affection, about my grandfather's choice to hide truth for a time. I thought about all the men and women who'd lived and died in margins. Money had been a means, a tool with dirty edges. What mattered, I realized, was not the currency but how it was put to use. A year later, Roland's sentence stood and Ashford Industries was smaller. Veronica called on his birthday to say she had read an interview about me teaching at the clinic. "I'm glad," she said. There was no contrition left to ring from her voice, and that was fine. People change not because others demand it, but when they find it unavoidable. Sometimes an audience will tell you that art has made them feel something like truth. Once, after a program at the clinic, a veteran approached me. He had deep lines carved into his face and a small scar near his jaw. "I heard the code," he said softly. "My unit heard those signals once, a long time ago." I didn't know what it meant, but something in that rhythm told me a story had ended. He put his hand over mine for a moment and then walked away. What more could a man ask for than to have made a life that echoes? The journal remained in my possession, a relic and a map. I still open it sometimes on late nights, tracing his marginalia like Braille. In the margins of the Redemption Suite, Eugene had written a final note, "Play not to be heard, but to be remembered." It reads now as both instruction and benediction. I still practice 6 hours a day. I still tour less. My life is quieter and less gilded. My apartment is a modest place near the river where neighbors greet each other, and the baker knows my morning order. The foundation reports pile up in a neat corner. I answer letters from families who thank us and from people who are angry that the outcome wasn't decisive enough. That is how repair works. Messy, partial, sometimes imperfect, always human. On certain nights, when the wind moves across Lake Michigan and the high buildings throw long shadows, I play Moonlight Serenade at the end of a program. I alter the rhythm slightly now, a Morse-like stutter in the third bar, a private cadence for those who remember what it took to be heard. Occasionally, an old veteran will look up from the audience with a small nod, the sort of recognition that pries open the fragile door between one person's night and another's dawn. Eugene's gamble had not been only for money. It was for the telling. I inherited not merely accounts and ledger entries, but a test of whether silence or speech would shape our family's meaning. I chose speech. It cost me a marriage and hours of quiet practice, but it gave me a larger thing, a life in which the music I make helps others carry the weight they cannot lift alone. Sometimes I think of the men who smoothed the edges of that fortune in rooms where no music played. Perhaps they lived tidy lives, or perhaps they lived awake at night. I prefer to imagine instead an audience gathered in a small hall, listening, because the act of listening is a kind of justice in itself. If you listen closely, sometimes the world will tell you what it needs to repair. If you play the right notes, sometimes it will let you start.